And a short time ago, I was joined from Newcastle by the Chief Government Whip, Joel Fitzgibbon. Joel Fitzgibbon, why is it the Greens' fault all of a sudden that Labor's primary vote is abysmal? Isn't that your fault?
Well, I think what you're seeing here is a manifestation of a lot of pent-up pressure over the last couple of years in particular, and it all came to a head, of course, in the last parliamentary sitting week when the Greens stifled any opportunity we had to finding a workable solution to the very serious asylum seeker issue. I mean, the Greens stood alone in that parliament as the only group not prepared to compromise and embrace some form of offshore processing.
But on that issue, the Greens and the Coalition have had a consistent position on that for quite a long time. If you ask the average punter what the Greens were going to do on that, they would say, you know, here's what their policy is. If you ask the average punter about Labor, they'd say, oh, well, you know, they used to support getting rid of offshore processing because it was inhumane and now they support something else. I'm not really sure. Isn't the issue here that voters aren't sure what Labor stands for?
Well, we've all had consistent positions, but in a hung parliament, we need to learn to compromise or at least become part of the conversation. I mean, it wasn't only the major parties that were prepared to give a bit. People as diverse as Bob Katter, Rob Oakeshott, Tony Windsor and Andrew Wilkie were all prepared to give ground. Indeed, in the end, voted for offshore processing. The Greens, I think, were wrong to stand alone and denied the Parliament an opportunity to walk away that week with a workable solution. So
is this discussion now about distancing yourself from the Greens all a payback for their position on asylum seekers?
Look, I think it's for me, it's simply about accountability. If the Greens want to do these things, that's fine. The main objective of my article in The Telegraph was to ensure that people understood what they had done. Now, you know, they're now through 10% in the order of 12% of the primary vote. Now, the major parties spend most of their time being held to account for their policies. Yet we allowed the Greens to go out there with populist and sometimes extreme policies in order to drag away from the major parties and in particular the Labor Party our primary vote. And we, in a way, encouraged them to do so by sending the message that no matter what they do or say, they will receive Labor preferences at the next election. Well, I think that has to change.
But it's not like the Greens have released a whole heap of policies overnight. They've had these policies for a long time. Why is Labor going down this route now?
Well, because I think the asylum seeker debacle was a siren call for me, but I think to people generally. It's a realisation that if the Greens want to be a major force holding more than 10% of the primary vote, they should face serious levels of accountability. People should know what they stand for, because the reality is that we are almost giving them our imprimatur to go out there with populist policies, steal our vote, and then, of course, be rewarded with preferences. Well, maybe preferences are only one of the few levers we have to ensure they face the same sort of accountability as we do.
Is it fair to say, though, that the progressive part of Labor's base has drifted to the Greens, not because of the Greens' appeal, but because people are disillusioned with Labor?
No, look, Labor got a very solid proportion of the primary vote at the last election and will continue to do so. But as you know, Labor's base vote has been effectively split for a long time between what I would call the traditional blue-collar base and the more progressive base you'll typically find around the capital cities. And the Greens are exploiting this. They're going out there with extreme policies. I used the example today, the abolition of all TAFE fees and charges. Now, we would all like to do that, but it's not realistic. We have all of our policies costed. No one's asked the Greens to cost their education policy. I suspect, having had a look at it, it would run to the billions of dollars. And all I'm saying is that they should be held to account. And one of the levers we have in order to hold them to account is to say, well, if you're going to be out there with populist and in some circumstances extreme policies, we're going to reflect on where we send our preferences.
Do you think that those working class voters that you've identified as making up half of your base are confused that Labor and the Greens are basically the same thing?
Well, they shouldn't be confused. We have to stay on message, and we need to be able to demonstrate that we remain independent of the Greens. We create our own policy and progress our own policy. There is an emerging perception in the community since the advent of the hung parliament and the deal with the Greens that we are being, as someone put it today, pulled by the nose by the Greens. It's about time we sent a very clear message that that isn't the case, and the preference arrangements is one tool available in which to do so.
You have a formal agreement in writing with the Greens to retain government, yet now some Labor figures are labelling them loony extremists. Does this also add to the impression that it's unclear what Labor stands for? One minute you're in bed with the Greens and the next minute they're in the doghouse.
Well, just because we might disagree with the Greens in a range of areas doesn't mean we can't work with the Greens in areas in which there is agreement. The carbon price is the perfect example.
On this question of drifting to the Greens, let me give you the example of gay marriage. Your traditional base overwhelmingly supports the rights of gays to marry, but the Prime Minister's opposed to it, along with half the Cabinet. So again, the problem here is with Labor itself, isn't it, in that you are not reflecting the values of your own base?
Well, that's certainly a good example of the split in our base, the one I spoke about earlier, the traditional blue-collar workers and those that typically are more progressive and congregate in the capital cities. And these issues are complicated enough for us without allowing the perception to stand that we are too close to the Greens.
Joel Fitzgibbon, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lee. That's a pleasure.